All right, it's my distinct pleasure to call this House to order. Today, our teams are debating the motion that water should not be privatized. On the affirmative side, we have Monash University 1. On the affirmative side, we have University of Sydney 1. On the negative side, we have Monash University 1.
Coming as I do from a drought-stricken farming family, I know only too well the new reality of dwindling supply of water and increasing usage that we've seen in the 5 years of drought that Australia has only just come out of, and in the devastating drought in the south of England that occurred a couple of years ago. In that environment, governments face a choice, and that is a choice between allowing the allocation of that scarce resource to be controlled by the vicissitudes of the invisible hand of the market, or allowing that to be controlled by a government cognizant of the social priorities that go into allocating the most crucial thing that mankind needs. We want to do a few things. Well, only one, but there's 4 steps to it. First off, we're not talking about bottled water. Secondly, in countries which have government water utilities now, who are facing a choice as to what to do with them, they ought to keep them and not privatise those utilities. Thirdly, that may be in the form either of continuing direct government control or through corporatised entities or government business entities that still remain in the control of government and in the hands of the people. And fourthly, this debate occurs in the first world. So why do we want to do this? The first and most important reason is to preserve access to water. The second is to preserve social priorities in its allocation. And the third is because we think that utilities are natural monopolies that shouldn't be allowed to fall into private hands. So firstly, we need to preserve access to water. And it will be a fundamental and important fact of this debate that water is the most important thing for the survival of human beings, but what's more, that it arises from the commons of the world and from the commons of mankind, and is the natural property of no one, and the natural property of everyone, all at once. And given that reality, we think that it is absolutely crucial that all people, regardless of their wealth or their ability to pay, have access to that water. So firstly, we need to ensure that access to water is not based on wealth, because everyone needs to be able to access those things that they need. And only a government which is not seeking private rents can set the prices of water at such a level that everyone can get the water that they need, that everyone can access clean water and doesn't have to go to sources of water that are not safe for them, and that everyone can get water regardless of where they live. So this then acknowledges that the price signal is important, but we believe that that price signal needs to be negotiated between a government and its people, and not between a people and a harsh and cruel private market. Secondly, access to water need not be dependent and cannot be dependent on geography. And the reality of the situation of a private market is that the people who need water most are often the people to whom it is most expensive to supply it to. So the reality is that many areas of this country and many countries around the world are drought-stricken or are dry or are arid or have very little water infrastructure of their own and require huge investment to get that water to them. Private corporations are in a position that they want to provide water to the places where it is cheapest to provide that water, and not to the places where that water is needed most, which is why the incentive structure of water needs to be placed in the hands of an entity whose incentive is to get it to everyone. Now, we think that it's true, that often governments, when they privatise something, will put in a contractual term and something has to be provided to those areas. We think that that has worked stunningly poorly in the case, for instance, of Telstra, where bush services in Australia are universally awful. We think it's worked stunningly awfully in the case of, for instance, Enron, where they refused to provide energy infrastructure in poor Hispanic communities because they couldn't make a profit out of it. We think the reasons that that works stunningly poorly are in the first place, those corporations become incredibly powerful once those terms come into play. And in the second place, that there is no ability for private citizens to sue against those contracts between governments and corporations under the usual administrative law remedies that are intended to protect people from government misuse of their powers. But the second argument that we want to draw, given that we've demonstrated that we think that access cannot be guaranteed under the private system, is that we need to preserve the social priorities determining allocation of water. We think in the first place that the overall level of consumption is something which private corporations have an incentive to regulate in a way that often ignores social priorities and ignores the way that the government would want to regulate that. So, for instance, we think that there's an inherent conflict of interest for a private corporation during a time of drought, when a government will have an incentive to preserve long-term supply through things like water restrictions, whereas a private corporation has a very direct incentive to sell as much water as possible during that drought. In the first place, because they're in the business of selling water, and in the second place, because the price of that water will be higher for a short period of drought than it will be over a long period of water restrictions where the demand for that water is restricted. But the second problem with social priorities is that we think that the rights to water between communities are something that is not well regulated by a private market. So when you look at a situation such as the Murray-Darling system, we think that the people of Adelaide have a very large interest in the health of that system, in the cleanliness of the water, and the supply of the water that goes into that. But there are any number of people making a hell of a lot of money and grazing and cotton upstream from there that we think that private producers are going to want to sell water to, because generally speaking they can afford to pay more for it than private homes can. That's a bad way of dealing with things, when both of those communities need consideration, and when the market will set prices that are unreasonable for the communities like Adelaide which have low access to water. But thirdly, when you look at competition between interests in industries, we think that oftentimes the market consideration will ignore the social considerations and the kind of basic moral considerations that a government can take into account. So, for instance, cotton is an incredibly profitable industry, but its use of water is very, very wasteful. The reality of that is that a private corporation has a good incentive to continue to sell water to cotton farms and a bad incentive to sell water to farms which make less money but use water far more efficiently and far less wastefully, like basic grazing, like any other kind of farming you can do around a river system. We think those moral considerations are important, and we think that lowering the supply of water to those people who use it immorally is a good idea. So the market seeks profit and wealth, whereas government seeks to balance a variety of considerations. So finally, utilities are natural monopolies, and as a result are simply inappropriate for privatisation. We think that when there are enough corporations in a market, the prices tend towards zero and tend towards a socially optimal level. But when the number of corporations in that market tends towards one, then they're able to set the price at the maximum profit extraction stage, which is not the stage at which people are best able to buy the water they need. Water is a natural monopoly because it takes huge infrastructure and thus has natural barriers to entry. It's a natural monopoly because you need massive economies of scale in order to be at all profitable, which means you can't have many firms in a market. The reality of that then is that you can extract monopoly rents when you're a private corporation that's one of only one or two corporations in a market, or that basically have a monopoly over a large area of water production and water supply, and charge more than people can pay. That's precisely what happened in Britain, when over the first 9 years of water privatisation, prices rose 46% and profits rose 149%. If you own the only way that people can get the most basic thing that they need, you can charge essentially anything for that, and the invisible hand doesn't work at all. But what's more, you can engage in Enron-style price gouging and price manipulation to create short-term declines in supply in order to drive up price in the short term and extract those monopoly rents at the expense of meaning that people can't drink water for a couple of weeks while you increase the price by 700%. Ladies and gentlemen, water belongs to us all. We need to preserve access to it. We need to allocate it with a mind to social concerns, and we need to ensure that monopolies don't rise in this important area.
and their policy doesn't do it. Water is the best commodity to monopolise, to privatise, Mr. Speaker, because you don't have an endless supply of it. I have 3 points, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, the cost of water. Secondly, sustainability. And thirdly, on rent seekers. But let's make the model of the negative team very clear in this debate. We support the sale of all assets and contracts with regards to services like Victoria has done to City West Water and other organisations. Moreover, we'd allow competition in buying those and competing against each other. So that responds to Tim's monopoly point. But finally, we have a minimum standard. We say that every individual gets 155 litres of water, which is the Victorian standard right now, at a minimal price that is affordable, that is decided by government. Everything else is free market, go for your life. And the same with industry. You judge what the minimum standard is, you have an affordable price, then you spend more. I have the first argument on the cost of water. We say that water isn't correctly priced now, that it is fundamentally too cheap in the current market. The reason for that is governments have an interest to keep prices down. And the best example is in Victoria and in New South Wales, where government still has control of price, even where they have privatised it. We are removing that control of price. We are saying you can't control it anymore. And moreover, when no one owns that asset, when no one actually has a private interest in making sure it can continue to be accessed in the long term to actually have viability, there are no consequences when you keep allowing the sale. Our policy places ownership in the hands of private corporations, which allows them to judge the constant price of water. And when you have lowering reserves in almost every dam except for Queensland and the Northern Territory, we say that people are able to sell at the most appropriate price. And we say there's an ongoing incentive for government to actually use this type of water inefficiently, because what they want to do is make sure everyone is happy in their electorate. They don't want to be voted out. We say the short-term interest of government isn't the best price, isn't the best decider of price in this market. We say moreover that regulations fail in the current system. What we say is the regulation fails firstly because people can flat regulation easily. There are small fines and it's all about self-reporting and being caught. It's almost impossible to catch people breaking water restrictions. There have been minimal prosecutions in Victoria for that. But moreover, we say that things like non-binding caps, like Target 155, don't work if you don't have a financial disincentive not to continue to using water in the long term. And when you have a scarce resource that Tim wants to constantly talk about, it just doesn't work. On sustainability, we say that governments don't have a level of expertise and knowledge to manage these sorts of resources. We say they're overstretched right now, particularly state governments in Australia who are the ones who provide water, or state governments in the United States who also provide water. We say they don't have specific expertise. We say moreover, and this is important, they don't have the incentive to research and develop. And the best example of that is in Victoria right now with the desalination plant. That has to almost be built predominantly with private money because governments can't afford it themselves and they can't research and invest because there's actually no interest for them. When you allow them to have a financial interest to expand the amount of water that you can sell, do desalination or recycle water, you need a financial incentive to make your money back. Governments don't have that incentive right now. They don't have an incentive to continue water because what they say is they want to make sure that it still exists in the long term. We say moreover it's about efficient allocation. And we say that they're better at allocating because what they do is they say you have to pay the real price of water instead of an artificial one. Finally, on rent seekers, there's 2 points in this. Lobbying. We say firstly, when you have a commodity under government control, they're incredibly susceptible to lobbying. And the best example is what Tim wanted to trumpet. The Murray-Darling Basin and the concept that government allocate the types of water that they want to talk about has fundamentally failed to stop the type of drought we have in Victoria. Moreover, things like car producers who use clean water for pulp milling, Mr. Speaker, and don't have to pay the true price of that type of production. But secondly, on public pressure, we say that governments make decisions on electoral popularity. And it's popular to have lots of water because it's culturally important to Australians and it's important because people don't want to change their practices and don't want to be forced to change what they do. And we say that governments continue to make very minimal changes around the edges without having any financial disincentive to change that behaviour. What we say is that Australia is in a drought, Mr. Speaker, and most of the Western world will continue to be in one as as temperatures rise. We say you need a disincentive that people need to pay for the real price of water. We proudly beg to oppose.
Speech. We now call upon Steve Ryan to do the second affirmative speech.
Mr. Speaker, this negative case occurs 5 years ago, before droughts made water the most sensitive political issue for most Australians, before water restrictions in our capital cities massively clamped down on use, before the dam levels in capital cities are reported every night on the news. The idea that governments don't care or governments were asleep at the wheel was a fiction of the past and not reflective of the present reality. I'll deal with two things in rebuttal. Firstly, the quality of allocation by governments. What the opposition said is that governments are inherently slow to respond because they act on 3-year cycles, not long-term cycles. This speaks to a conceptual problem with the approach of the negative team. It's not governments in isolation, it's governments against companies who report on a quarterly earnings report basis, who have financial year incentives by which their executives get remuneration bonuses. It's governments who account, rather companies, who account to a tiny number of immensely wealthy shareholders versus governments who are accountable to all of the people. But secondly, there is a 3-year electoral cycle incentive in sensible long-term management. Like Kevin Rudd got elected, passing on a platform to implement an emissions trading scheme that wouldn't come into place until after the next election. People in this country understand the need for long-term environmental planning, and it is politically popular. But secondly, we'd say, just the fact that governments don't increase the price proves very little. We think it's good that governments have the flexibility to, instead of jacking up the price so that people can't afford water, to instead put in restrictions on the amount they can have and the quotas as to how they can use them. And when the opposition said, well, they don't enforce water restrictions, that's firstly just not true of the places where water restrictions have been used and enforced, like Brisbane and like Sydney. But secondly, enforce them better. Sell water to the private sector instead. Then they said, Mr. Speaker, well, the price is one calculated by the market and that they won't use it all up in droughts. It works like this. When the companies make the decisions on the price, they do a calculation of cost now over a time period to figure out maximum profit. That calculation in and of itself is insidious compared to the calculation that a government makes about the needs of everyone over the medium term and the long term to have equal access to water. And we'd say when you can sell most of your resources in a short term at a higher price, that's why governments that's why companies will sell out. But it also flies in the face of the empirical reality of privatisation in Britain and the empirical reality of what monopoly rents do to prices and do to profits at the expense of people. Then they said, well, governments don't have the expertise or the money to invest. They don't have an incentive to invest in infrastructure. Well, that's strange, because we think, given that governments have an incentive in people being able to drink water because their constituents do, they've probably got a far better incentive to build new and better infrastructure than a company that needs to keep costs down in order to keep profits up. But then they said, well, they can't attract experts. With all due respect to water scientists, they're not investment bankers. Like, the government's not competing with $30 million salaries to get the best water expert. They can pay very competitive wages to attract very competitive people. And indeed, most of the people in these sorts of industries are interested in helping the public and helping the public good. In terms of companies then, they said companies are great. This is the important second half of the debate. They said if you want accountability over companies, just sue them. What a great way for ma and pa grazers to get accountability. Launch a multi-million-dollar suit against a gigantic conglomerate that can tie you up in court for years, instead of writing a letter to your local member, instead of using freedom of information, judicial review, ballot pressure, political parties, political funding, political advertisements to to achieve accountability. We think companies are grossly unaccountable, and we think the negative think so too. Because when they announced their model that they use contracts to regulate the amount people could have and to regulate their access, it begged a really obvious question to this House. Why not let the people control it in the first place if you acknowledge the companies won't? To move to my substantive material, we'd say firstly that in terms of safety and accountability, government-controlled water is far better. We'd say firstly that companies, because of their need to make a profit, have a big incentive to try and keep costs down and to keep the costs of regulatory compliance with safety standards and investment in infrastructure as low as possible to keep their profits high. We'd say you can try and regulate that through contract, but it's very slow and it's very inefficient as a way of getting redress when you have a contract and you're trying to sue a company for breach instead of like voting against a government or having a public backlash against a government. And we saw that in the fact that Enron was so negligent in their investment in energy infrastructure that there are now frequent brownouts across California. We saw that in the fact that British Rail was privatised and had so many safety problems that the British government had to take it back over because, lo and behold, people weren't happy with the government outsourcing their accountability to make sure people didn't die on trains, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, that's what we think happens here. For the government to allow control over the safety of the water that we drink and the water that we put into our foods to be held in the hands of companies with an incentive to keep that cost down is reprehensible, Mr. Speaker. We don't think it's acceptable for government to abridge all of the accountability mechanisms that people would have against them and outsource it instead to contract over private companies. And now we're aware that Tim said, well, if the problem is you can't do enough to private companies, then let people do more things to them. Again, that's already our model, Mr. Speaker. But in addition to that, we'd say people just deserve direct public accountability. When a good is so crucial and so important to human survival and human life, we don't think it's okay for the government to let the market be involved and to place companies as a roadblock and as an excuse on questions of price, questions on allocation, and questions of balancing competing interests. We'd say secondly then, in terms of control and planning policy, this is a situation that reduces the government's policy space. So what happens when the government contracts with private companies is that when it needs to change policies, whether they be safety policies like the government needed to do in Sydney after the cryptosporidium outbreak, or whether they be planning policies, the government is liable to pay huge breach compensations to the private companies when it tries to tack its policy in response to new threats. So public water in Sydney was able to implement new and sweeping cryptosporidium reforms, whereas private water in central western Queensland had to pay huge amounts of breach damages when they tried to do the same thing. And indeed we've seen it in Sydney, where the government's decision to build the Western Metro has meant before they can go ahead with that, they have to pay multi-millions of dollars in compensation to the light rail operators because of contract. So we'd say contracting out the ownership of public goods reduces the space that the government has to create and make new policy. Thirdly then, we'd say that the sell-offs, and this is my third point, that the sell-offs that governments make of public goods occur on really unfavourable terms in really unfavourable circumstances. So governments by and large don't move to privatise goods to achieve the utopian ideals of the negative team. Most of the time they sell off assets in times of budgetary crisis and times of budgetary deficit. So that's why we've seen the global financial crisis lead to Queensland announcing a fire sale of its assets and New South Wales announcing a fire sale of all of its electricity and of its lotteries businesses. So the effect is that the political reality of privatisations leads to sales below the market value, and specifically leads to the sales of things like dams, pipelines and transmission networks that people's tax dollars pay for through the nose over a long period of time, being sold to private companies for profit at far below their market value and on unfavourable terms. And indeed we'd say, in the context of state governments in Australia being in a financial crisis, we question how much negotiating power they have against these private companies. Like, how do we achieve a whole range of contractual concessions when they know the governments are only selling these assets to avoid going bankrupt, Mr. Speaker? We'd say if you want accountability for the people, if you want allocational decisions by the people, you want safety and policy space for the people, don't accept the negatives model which tries to co-opt in those things through contract. Accept the affirmatives model that doesn't in the first place.
thank the second speaker for his speech. We're now calling the second speaker for the negative side of the meeting.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, we told you in the negative that the government is an inappropriate custodian to deal with water. And what the affirmative team said in response to that was, well, maybe they were 5 years ago, but now water is important enough, the government won't make these mistakes again. We do not trust the government because we think there are inherent problems with responding to an electorate. That means you cannot do the things you need to do to preserve a scarce resource. The inherent problem with government is that the government is the last mover because it is bound to be conservative, because if it acts forward, if it acts early, then it gets elected out of office because it's moving too quickly than their opposition. Kevin Rudd, they told us, was elected to fight climate change. Absolutely. Where is my emissions trading scheme, ladies and gentlemen? It's not here. More importantly, when we are going to get it, it's going to be so watered down it will do nothing. It will do no good because they have to compensate private companies and individuals so much. That's the problem with getting government to regulate something that is so important. I have 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, is the government the best custodian of water? Secondly, what is the best way to reduce water? And thirdly, equity. So firstly, is the government the best custodian? We gave you 4 key reasons why the government is just an inappropriate custodian for water. The first is that they are sensitive to the public. And when water is primarily used by the public and we need to reduce consumption, we said government is the wrong actor because they are responsive to public demands and so they're not going to be harsh enough, quite simply. And we think that when something is scarce and non-renewable like water, you need to have a harsh actor that is willing to raise prices, and that is the private sector. The second reason we gave you was that government is sensitive to corporate lobbying. In particular, government is sensitive to whole swathes of industrial lobbying. We pointed you to the examples of cotton farming and even more worryingly, rice farming, which shouldn't exist in Australia but only do because of vast government subsidies. And those are the exact ways that government will direct water use. We had absolutely no response to that from the second speaker. I look forward to the third speaker's response. The third reason we gave why the government is an inappropriate custodian is because governments have competing priorities. They have to do so many things, and there's only so much money and only so much expertise they can leverage towards this very important problem. We compared that to a private company whose sole domain was selling this water and also investing in the future of that industry. We told you that that company and its profit motive and its desire to survive into the future is the best actor to invest, and we never heard a response to that. And fourthly and finally, we told you that the government is just bad at dealing with water because government ownership led to the very problems that we're dealing with right now because the government is the last mover. It's limited by the reality of politics. If you move early, you look bad. That was the reality we learned with climate change. No government on earth was able to move early enough because you had to get all of the body politics to agree with you. Private companies don't have to get people to agree with them. They have to see how much water there is, how much they can sell it for, and price it accordingly. We think the limitations of government means they should not be the custodians. To my second point, how do we best reduce water use? Because governments, especially in Victoria, where we have a significant drought, have tried so many things to reduce water use, except for one. What is the one thing that Victorian government has never tried to reduce water use? Increasing price, ladies and gentlemen. Because they know it's politically unpalatable. But that is the most important thing that a government or anyone can do to reduce consumption, increase price. What we heard from the second affirmative was, if regulation is the problem, just regulate more. Just crack down on people using more water. That's the problem. Water use is fundamentally personal. There's only so much you can watch people shower, ladies and gentlemen. There's only so much you can go into people's backyards. Under the affirmative team's model, to have actual proper enforcement, you would need 1 million water officers going into every home in Victoria to maintain it. We think the best method of regulation is price. It's self-regulated, ladies and gentlemen. People only use what they can afford. If they cannot afford it, they don't. And when something is as important as water, we want price to be high. And we think the affirmative needs to answer what they want. Do they want us to preserve water into the future and thus have high prices? Or do they want the government to make water available and have low prices? They've been schizophrenic on this point. I look forward again to a response from Chris. Finally, on equity. It was a complete furphy and comfortably dropped by Stephen second that equity in water allocation was a fundamental priority. We told you that our model is able to do both. Have minimum standards of water that people need to live, because we recognise that that water is a unique thing that has its own priorities, but most importantly, that every litre of water that you use above your minimum spend should be costed. It should be allocated into your price so that you use less or so that you change your conduct. We think that's particularly important and we would like to hear a response to that. On to my positive material. I'm going to look at 2 things in this debate. Firstly, individual consumption patterns, and secondly, resource morality. So firstly, individual consumption patterns. Mr. Speaker, in this debate, we think it's fundamental that that we must reduce water consumption on the individual level, and importantly, it must be a choice. Why? Well, firstly, we think we have to reduce use as opposed to other things like climate change, where you can just get power from something else. Because right now, there's no alternative to water. What we do have is things like desalination plants, which at a minimum can provide some stopgap. But on the long term, there's actually no alternative apart from reducing use. That's why we think the government, again, is an appropriate actor to regulate this, because they can just give water out. But when it comes to doing what needs to be doing, which is reducing its use, government is going to be inherently, and already has proven to be, very bad at reducing individual use. But the real reason why we need to reduce individual consumption patterns and why it needs to be a choice is because you can never force people to use less water. It must be an individual choice, and we think the best way, and frankly the only way we can do it without controlling people bodily, is to do it with price. Price is the thing that human beings are most sensitive to in the Western world, and we think that things like the failure of water restrictions in Victoria, that is Victoria, my state, not the university, Jason, we think that the failure of water restrictions in Victoria is testament to the fact that you can tell people to do the right thing, but ultimately it won't mean they'll use as little water as they need to for us to maintain water into the future. So how does our model affect consumption patterns, Mr. Speaker? 3 ways. Firstly, when price increases, people use less because they can afford to use less. We are happy to celebrate under the negative team because water is so important and scarce that we don't think people can just keep literally flushing it down the toilet. Secondly, the second reason why our model leads to reduction in individual consumption is because increases in price lead people to market-based alternatives like investing in a rainwater tank and using that for your garden and your washing. Those are the things where if you have to make an outlay and no one is giving you an incentive to make that initial financial outlay, you do not pay for that, Mr. Speaker. We think the government subsidies can only go so far. We need a strong incentive, and that is making the price more expensive so people turn to those other, more renewable alternatives. And thirdly and finally, the reason we reduce individual consumption patterns is because we change attitudes to water. As long as government is the custodian, as long as government is pressured by industry and people at elections, people have the conception that they can always get more water, that the government will always look after them. It's really important, we think, to individualise people's understanding of the water shortage, to make people know that every cent they have to spend more is because we don't have enough water. We need to change attitudes to water. That's what our model does, but the affirmative team keeps people in the belief that government will look after you. On to my final point, resource morality. Mr. Speaker, it will come as no surprise that water is scarce and not renewable. What that means is that every bit of water allocation has to be done as equitably and morally correctly as possible. It's particularly true because future generations are deprived of water and that cannot be remedied, and they're particularly voiceless in the current climate. It means that if a resource is allocated, it must be done fairly. Under a public ownership model, which is what the affirmative team has advocated, water is distributed too widely because of political pressures and too cheaply because there is no price incentive to price it accordingly. The outcome of that is an immoral distribution of water, which isn't remedied. People in the future have no choice and no way to remedy the situation because water is being distributed by governments based on their present-day demands from present-day people. Contrast this to a market-based approach, where yes, water is distributed, but it is the most equitable way we possibly can distribute water because people who most desire it, who most want it, who are most willing to pay for it, do. We preserve more water for the long term, and we think that that's fairer. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this debate, the affirmative team were happy to celebrate the flexibility of government in allocating water. What we said is you can't celebrate flexibility and actually reduce water use. Water is too cheap, that's the problem.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your speech. We now call on the third affirmative speaker, Chris Crowe.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hate libertarians. For the very simple reason that they crave simplicity in a complex world. The argument that we've had from the negative essentially suggests that because things like climate change and water policy might be tough, that we should outsource public decisions like that to private corporations. It beggars belief, ladies and gentlemen, to suggest that they think politics is so inextricably incapable of making any decision ever that involves the adjudication of the public interest, that they should then delegate that to the private sector. And what a privilege it is to be standing here in the People's House defending the People's House today. There's two things I want to ask in my speech today. The first is, who is the better actor when it comes to preserving the sustainability and managing our water resources? But second, what the vital governmental interest in preserving ownership of our water resources is in the modern world. To the first of these, this question of sustainability. The negative have constantly been harping on about the scarce and non-renewable resource that water is, as if they miss Year 1 History Society and its environment, where they learn of the water cycle, which happened to illustrate that water is effectively a renewable resource if managed correctly. So we don't accept that sustainability is the only prism at which you can judge today's debate. But we also think it's one in which, if that is your metric for governing today's debate, we think it's one that government ownership is much better at preserving. So let's go through the reasons. The first thing they said is that water is fundamentally too cheap, and the only way in which we can reduce use is to use price. Yet breathlessly, Tim, in his speech, after he mentioned this, and mentioned that Victoria was unable to enforce its water restrictions. Well, what is stopping Victoria from enforcing a law in its books that New South Wales and Queensland and countries all around the world enforce? There's clearly a viable alternative. But moreover, we think it's better and fairer to use systems like that than to use price as a blunt measure and as a tax on the poor to deny their use and allow the rich to effectively sort of outsource their own environmental obligations to the poor. We think that's fundamentally unjust. But second, we actually think that the government can still use price anyway, because they do charge a price for water. But more realistically, we think that it's better to have government ownership, because we're not having the situation of having outsourced a natural monopoly analysis which has never been responded to, because we're never going to get competition in the water market because the barriers to entry are too high, there's never going to be enough players. So it turns into a massive handout to the private sector. So we recognise that on that level their analysis didn't hold. The second thing they wanted to say was that governments are inevitably caught in a regulatory capture, that there's going to be handouts to cotton farmers. One, we don't accept that governments can never buck these interests. We think governments retain regulatory flexibility under this model and would more easily be able to implement the sorts of policies we're seeing in the northwest of New South Wales, where the government is just cancelling water rights and buying back water rights, or we're seeing in the Murray-Darling at the moment. Because if you had a private operator in this particular instance, the government's capacity to act would be enormously constrained because they granted them a long-term concession and they couldn't be seen to be taking that back without having to pay enormous compensation, which we never think would be forthcoming. So we don't think you're going to get that particular problem. The third thing they wanted to say was that government was just like or private sector was just a more effective manager because the government was a last mover in a drought. It was unclear what this meant, but we would point out that when it comes to management of scarce water resources in a drought, the incentive structure of a government, as opposed to a private corporation, is fundamentally different. A private corporation has a desire to meet short-term earnings targets to, say, satisfy the market, but moreover, its only measurement of a successful water company is how much water is sold. So there's an incentive to always be selling as much water as possible to maximise profits. And even if there's not much water, the price will go up because of scarcity, so they'll be making even more profits. There's less of an incentive for them to be able to sort of restrict the use of water, but moreover, there's less of a capacity capacity to sort of charge a fair price. The final thing they wanted to say was that politics just simply won't work, and that governments were incapable of making tough decisions on things like water restrictions. Well, how is water restrictions going to work with a private company? They're not going to be out there as the water police, stopping people from using their products, trying to sort of lower their profits by preventing people using water in the first place. The final thing the actual final thing they mentioned was that water is just a private matter, as if there was no way we could properly regulate the use of water if we had a government on it. As if water meters didn't exist in society. You don't have to watch people shower as much as these guys might like that. It's a situation where we just read the meter. This is the second frame of today's debate that we get to. Recognising that government is going to be a more efficient and sustainable actor is what is the vital social and governmental interest in preserving ownership of water. We say it's threefold. First, we preserve access. Now they agreed that access was important. They just said they wanted a minimum standard of 155 litres. It's unclear what time frame this was, but to give you some indication, when I went to the bathroom earlier, it told me that a flush was 6 litres. Now flushing the toilet 25 times a week or a year is a negligible amount of water. So the net impact of their model is they're just going to be denying people what everyone thinks is a basic human right and a common good. And that's the second thing we'd say. This model is effectively a tax on the poor, because they want more income of poor people to go on a basic social necessity than on anything else. We think it is unjust, and we think it is entirely appropriate that in modern liberal society that a government subsidise the costs of its water for its poorest citizens and for all citizens. But the third thing that we say about this, about the access question, is that because water is inevitably a natural monopoly, you're never going to get competition in a privatised water market to the extent that you would need to get efficiency gains, or you would have to introduce so many regulations to preserve the social imperatives or social desires you want in preserving access that you wouldn't get any efficiency gains. So we saw in the privatisation of water in the United Kingdom in the late 1980s and early 1990s that prices went through the roof, profits went up, and there was a massive handout to corporate investors. We think that's just fundamentally silly public policy. The second governmental interest that we think is important is one of safety. It's entirely unresponded to in a mid-speech. We think that our water use is the hidden underbelly of our society. And so far, it's one of our great vulnerabilities. And the reporting of its safety and investment in safety is something that the corporate sector and the privatised sector has never distinguished itself on. And we think for that reason it's worth preserving. The final thing that we say is that because it is a vital social service, and nobody disputes that, we think it necessarily should be an accountable one. Now, all they said was that well, you can still be accountable against a private corporation. We say, one, a contract is necessarily a very blunt measure as opposed to the accountability of the political process. Because it relies on access to courts, it relies on stuff being in the contract in the first place, and we think that the failure of almost all grassroots legal action against Telstra, which basically bullied it out of court, is a pretty strong indication of that. Mr. Speaker, we trust the government, we trust the political process, and we want our water to stay public.
speech, I would now call Fiona from Monash for her name.
Mr. Speaker, what stunning analysis we just heard from Chris. The water is renewable, guys, so there's no real problem in this debate. We think that undermines what most of his team said and what our team has constantly stood for in today's debate. That we face a water crisis, that this water crisis is in particular very problematic in places like Australia, and that water use needs to change. The question before the House today is what's the best way to change that use? Is it through regulation, which we think has constantly failed in examples like Victoria? And is it through negotiated outcomes? Who knows what they are? Or is it through changing the financial calculus that individuals currently undertake? And we think making the price of water more expensive is the only way that you can ensure that water is going to be preserved going forward. Let's look at three things at the end of today's debate. Let's firstly look at the capacity of governments to lobby and to be susceptible to lobby groups here. Let's secondly look at the failings or perceived failings of corporations in the debate today. And let's further look at the government responsibility regarding the supply of water. Onto this first thing concerning industry. What we heard from their first speaker was that cotton farming is actually really profitable, but it's quite wasteful in terms of water. That was the extent of their analysis. We didn't hear why that would necessarily change, but it's under the status quo, which is what they support. Industries like cotton farming and rice farming run rampant. And we gave them several reasons as to why that's the case and why that won't change, and they didn't tell us why that wasn't the case. Under the status quo, water is cheap for these particular industries that are unsustainable. It's cheap for car manufacturers, it's cheap for rice farmers. The reason why it's cheap is because governments have various interests that they need to satisfy. And in spite of what they might like to think, water isn't the only interest of state and federal governments, ladies and gentlemen. They also have interests like employing large sectors of rural communities, hence the large pressure that we see that rice farmers place on governments to ensure that their livelihoods can continue, and they can only continue when water prices remain low. We don't think that we've heard any reason as to why those particular pressures change and why that calculus changes at a point in government. We also think that they have interests of elections. And when they tell us about how poor people are going to be affected by rising prices of water, then they can see that under their proposal they don't really want the price of water to go up, and they're just basically hoping that it's going to rain overnight. I'm pretty sure we've all been hoping for that for a while, and that's not really a viable solution here. We told you that there is a perverse incentive that exists here that paralyses governments, even if they had the best of intentions, from being able to make these hard environmental policy decisions. Specifically in terms of water, but also in terms of examples when we look at the emissions trading scheme, which is an abominable failure of our federal government. So we think that the assertion that governments are going to be able to overcome this just has never been proved in today's debate. Then what we went on to hear is that this will lead to a monopoly. We think that that was completely overstated by the affirmative team in today's case. We do allow for competition under the proposal that we're supporting in today's debate. We think that when we look specifically to the example of the state of Victoria, there are 4 different private water providers, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this assertion that a monopoly is automatically going to spring up is not the case when we think that the room for profit, given we're dealing with a scarce resource, is so great that leads to a high level of competition amongst the free market. We'd say even if that wasn't the case, we're prepared to wear a monopoly when the stakes are so high under the status quo, because at least the price of water would be going up and people's calculus would change, the basis and the ease upon which they could use water would change. What we then heard from Chris in particular is it's unfair if poor people have to pay more money for water. But under their proposal, they're okay if they have to pay more money for water as long as it was a negotiated outcome between governments and water providers in these situations. So we think it's quite philosophically inconsistent for them to cry wolf about poor people in today's debate, but supposedly if they want consumption to decrease, then they also had to punish those very same people. Let's move on to the second issue in terms of the perceived failings of corporations. What we heard from them is that corporations have an incentive to keep costs down and to maximise profit. We didn't hear any engagement with the material that our first speaker brought you at the beginning of today's debate about how the private sector is in a superior position to governments to be able to invest in research and development. Because we think that the incentive that exists for private companies here is to remain an ongoing concern. And this is different to situations and examples of Enron because water is not guaranteed in spite of Chris's scientific experiences in school. Water is not guaranteed in places like Australia, and there are problems without solutions at the moment. That creates a clear imperative for corporations who wish to remain an ongoing concern to meet these particular failings that exist at the moment. We see the government is unable to do that under the status quo which they support. We look to examples where governments don't even have the financial capacity, let alone the political justification, to be able to build things like desalination plants and to invest in that type of technology that might enable those types of problems to be dealt with down the track. So we think that this idea that maximising profits will just lead to a depletion of this particular resource is not true, when the very business itself will cease to exist if there is no water for them to distribute in the future. We also think, though, that they're not going to flood the market in times of drought with water, ladies and gentlemen, because that would actually lead to it being less profitable for them under that type of proposal. Then what we heard from Steve is this argument that this limits the ability of governments to make future planning decisions. We just think, once again, this was incredibly overstated. We don't see that this has been a barrier to governments to being able to make decisions on things like public transport in places like New South Wales and in Victoria. We think that the types of problems that he wanted to speak about in his substantive material had to do with contracts, ladies and gentlemen. They didn't have to do with any inherent failings of privatisation in this debate. Then what we heard is that individuals deserve direct public accountability, and that being able to sue someone isn't as rewarding as being able to write a letter to your local member who may or may not read it and may or may not do anything about it. We think that governments are interested in things like elections, and we think elections turn on more than just water policies. When we look at historical Australian elections, we certainly don't think water is the linchpin in the upcoming state election in places like Victoria. So this assertion that writing a letter to your member is superior, then your ability to be able to sue a corporation is insufficient. We also think that there's no provision for you to be able to sue the government if they don't happen to be as goodwill as the characterisation of the affirmative team in today's debate. Then what we heard from Steve is that this will be a fire sale, that we'll have low prices paid for this. We just think that that's a complete assertion and a mischaracterisation of the basis and the climate upon which we are making these decisions to privatise. Maybe in New South Wales you have particular problems with funding, but that doesn't mean that necessarily all of these resources are going to be sold for next to nothing, especially when we see that this is a particularly lucrative industry given the scarcity of water. This will lead to a high level of competition at these levels. Let's finally look at government responsibility regarding the supply of water. What we heard from Tim is it's important for individuals to be able to drink. Well, yeah, guys, like we ensure a minimum standard, they claim that that wasn't sufficient. That's the current regulations that occur in Victoria, which supposedly they support as well. Regulations that restrict the ability for people to be able to consume water willy-nilly. What we then also heard is that we can't ensure, we can regulate here, we just need to regulate more. And that was Steve's only response. We think that was quite a glib response to the inherent failings that we see in things like regulation. The fact that it takes place in homes, the fact that it takes place after the fact and it's too late to get that water back from someone when it's already been misused, and the fact that we think there is a perverse incentive that exists, which means that we aren't currently regulating corporations and means that we won't currently regulate or in the future regulate businesses like the rice industry. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a problem and there is something that needs to be done. Changing the price of water is the only way to do that, and we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Fiona, for her speech. We now move to the first reply speech, which will be given by Monash and Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem that both teams recognised in this debate was about the management of a precious and scarce resource. We told you that privatisation would mean the true cost of water would be paid and that consumption would be reduced. The affirmative team were firstly unclear as to whether there was a problem in this debate. They were unclear about whether we're in the drought, and the scientific analysis we heard at third affirmative was seriously lacking. They were also unclear on the solution, about whether prices should go up or should go down, and how you achieve them. We said when it's something this important, and this important for all of humanity, that government cannot be trusted when they have failed in the past. I have two questions. How do we best solve the issue of a drought and a lack of water? And secondly, is selling water assets harmful to the public interest? On whether how we solve the best solutions, how we solve a drought, what we heard at the start was that there was a failure in the system when you privatise. Well, that's what the affirmative team first came out to. But what they weren't really sure about was actually whether there was a problem at all. Whether there was a problem in the system, whether there was a problem in privatisation, and actually how you solve those problems. The negatives were clear from the start. We told you the problem was a non-renewable resource that everyone needs, and we told you that governments had failed in the past. We told you that we needed price as an indicator and a changer of activity, because governments would never change the price. We pointed to the historical precedent that there hadn't been a change in price and that other things failed. We heard in response that all you should do is just enforce regulation. We said firstly that it failed, but we had an even if that they never analysed in this debate. And that even if was that you're never going to affect change if people don't pay the true price of their water consumption because you just keep consuming without paying. On price and determination, the negative team were just schizophrenic on this issue. It was unclear whether they were for an increase for a price, against an increase for a price, and you can't have that when you can't show us your solution to the problem. The negative team said the only way to get an increase is through privatisation, so you don't get the lobbying, you don't get rent seekers having the same effect when it's about the way you sell that resource. Finally, on research and development, we spoke about how they're better at research and development when it's your own private interest to do so. We pointed to desalination plants in Victoria. We pointed to how those things can only be funded through private corporations. Shrieks of silence from the affirmative team on that issue. So the only response we got was from Steve about specialisation was, well, they're not investment bankers. That wasn't our argument. Our argument was it's about the way governments are overstretched, and when you have the people who are specialised, it's best to put them in that corporation. On the second issue about is selling assets harmful to the public interest, we heard about safety from that side of the house, and we had several responses. The first one was we didn't think that was inherent within the system. We said that you can contract your way out of it, but moreover what we said in this area is that there are ways that private corporations often work in safety. We said it's in their interest to have a safe product. It's in their interest to sell the best product they can. It's not in interest with government. We spoke about accountability. What they said on their side of the house is, well, you don't have accountability inherent in the system. We had a couple of responses. The first one was, we thought our accountability was better, and the only accountability they could point to was writing to a member of parliament. What we said is, even if we sent out to the house, that part of that accountability is the problem in this debate. That when you're able to change elections on this sort of policy, that was harmful. When rent seekers could actually push their interests into the debate, something we didn't get a response to. Finally, on fairness, what we heard from Steve was that you get firebrand sales of assets that you didn't really have the investment into and you don't get your price back. We said there are lots of people who are willing to buy your assets, and that's an issue of context, not an issue of sale fundamentally. But on fairness, and this is where the negative team pushed ahead, fairness is about people paying the true price of water, paying for a resource they're taking that they will never give back. The motion falls.
We now move to the final reply speech that will be given by the University of Sydney by Tim Mooney.
anything at all. But the only refrain of the previous 12 minutes was that everything had gone unresponded to. But the most important thing to remember from this debate is that one team sought a single blunt metric of price increase to deal with the multifarious interests involved, and one team sought to have those multifarious and separate interests adjudicated by someone with an understanding of and an interest in all of those interests. So I'm going to ask 3 questions in reply. The first of those is, how do we best preserve sustainability in water? There were 2 competing ways of doing so. The first from our opposition was on price, and they said water is more expensive, people will use less. In the first place, in my speech, I pointed out that this would not happen evenly or happen fairly. And as Croak very aptly put it, this was a tax on the poor because higher prices had such a greater impact on most people than on anyone else. The second thing that we said is that the price interest is not one which necessarily pushes down water usage in the way that this team wanted. And every single speaker on this team pointed out that in a drought, when prices increased because of scarcity, the interest of a private corporation was to use that price increase to sell its water. The one response that we got in the rope-a-dope strategy of leaving it to the unresponded two-thirds speech was that people wouldn't want to sell all their assets. But as Steve had already pointed out, your interest is in selling your assets at the best price possible, regardless of when you sell those assets. We said the best metric was regulation. They said the price might rise. We said that was a good idea because people need to use water, even if they're poor. They secondly said that government could be lobbied by people, which was perplexing given that they wanted to hand over control to private corporations. But what's more, as Croak pointed out, that there was wide-scale cancellation of water licences through the statutory power that only government held, which Fee then perplexingly ignored by going straight back to the example of those very common licences that he told you that governments had got rid of. We then heard that it was too unpopular to have water restrictions, something which was empirically not true. When Steve pointed out vast public concern, water restrictions in many states that were only not being enforced in the one area where this team claimed to have special knowledge, which was Victoria. And when they said that they were unenforceable, it ignored the fact that their model had an enforceability of the amount of water that you use, and that, as we pointed out, that there were water meters that didn't need 1 million people to check them once a month. So the second question was, how do we preserve accessibility to water? We pointed to natural monopolies in this debate on the basis of barriers to entry and on the basis of economies of scale. There were 2 responses. The first was that their model would protect against these natural occurring factors. The second was that Melbourne has 4 water corporations. Again, in Fiona's speech, we said, well, in the first place, this was perplexing because it was called City West Water, a geographic monopoly over a certain area. And secondly, given that they had previously used the example of Melbourne to suggest that government ownership wouldn't push prices up, both of which could not be true in this debate, as they tried to use it for both the good and bad sides of their equation. Then we heard that there would be no investment, which was pointed out by Steve to be wrong, because you can only get large-scale investment from a government which isn't seeking to push costs down, which was claimed to have not been responded to by TJ. We pointed to the harsh inequities of this usage of water, but the final question was, how do we preserve accountability? We pointed to a suite of remedies available against the public, and they ridiculed that as writing a letter, despite there being 10 more in 2 successive speeches, demonstrating disrespect to Steve's argument. He contradicted TJ by saying that water was never enough of an issue to turn an election, when this team's case began by saying that it was so much of an issue that it would turn those elections. Ladies and gentlemen, we weren't unresponsive, but they were contradictory. This motion must stand.